You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. And if you're a turkey hunter in Mississippi, you probably know it was a really good spring in 2024. And here to tell us more details about it, Adam Butler, the Turkey Program Manager for Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks.
This episode of the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast is brought to you by the Foundation for Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt, and our guest is a return guest. Matter of fact, I think it might be the first return guest we've had. Fortunate enough to get to talk to Adam Butler with the Turkey Program here at MDWFP. Welcome back, Adam.
Glad to be here. Not very long since I was here before, but glad to be here again. Always opportunity to talk about turkeys.
Look forward to it. Have been looking forward to getting to catch back up with you because the word is that in spring of 24, we're on the back end of it now, but looking back at spring of 24 was a really an excellent turkey season for hunters here in Mississippi.
Yep, the numbers definitely show that. This was our 6th year of having game check, so our sort of real-time harvest reporting, hunters have to report their turkey harvest, and this was the best year we've had, by a pretty good margin. So I think the reported harvest this year was 15,400 some odd birds total. And, comparing that to our best year prior to this was only about 12,000, and the average has been kind of floating around 10-ish, 10, 11,000. So just numbers wise, we're up considerably over the last several years. If you look at the kind of the other immediate metric that we have, like our reported harvest from our WMAs, that was up a pretty good bit too, up about 30% over the 10-year average. So just based on the numbers, this was as good a season as we've had in several years. Now, I know there's probably some hunters out there who don't feel that same way, and not everybody's always going to experience all the good times all at once, but just overall, I think we had a really good year.
So overall, about a 25% increase, statewide, collectively, year over year.
For sure. And we kind of coming into it anticipated this would be really good. One of the sets of data that we keep on turkeys here at the Department of Wildlife is our summer brood survey. So brood being what you call kind of the group of a hen with her young. And we've got a data set on that where field staff kind of collect observations through the summertime that gives us a gauge on how good the hatch is. And 2 years ago, in 2022, was the best hatch we had had in nearly 25 years based on the numbers. And so, that usually indicates a good season 2 years later because, here in Mississippi, the year-old gobblers, the jakes, they're kind of off limits for most hunters, so they're not really factoring in the harvest. So it really takes those birds becoming adult turkeys, 2-year-old turkeys, for the harvest to really bump up. And so we knew, if our brood data was any count, we knew this was probably going to be a pretty good season, and it turned out it was.
Is that the primary factor, that brood number 2 years prior, or are there other things maybe too that factor into it being such a good year?
Brood number is the hatch, what the brood numbers indicate is probably the primary thing. Okay. Now there's some other things that go into that too, some stuff that you might not think about, like if we have bad weather, like turkeys tend to not gobble as much or be as active for hunters when it's rainy or when there's bad weather out. So if if we just get really bad weather on the first couple of weekends, that could kind of dampen the harvest a little bit. Stuff like that kind of plays into it some. You see that really being a big deal in states that have shorter seasons than we do. So like a state like Kentucky, for instance, that has a 3-week season. If they get bad weather 2 out of the 3 weekends of their season, it really brings their harvest total down. Whereas we're a much longer season, so it kind of, we have time for it to even out. But there's, little things like that. A lot of times, if we have like a late winter, sometimes the turkeys aren't quite in full on breeding mode, gobbling mode, when our season comes in. So you can see that affected a little bit. But overall, it's the number of turkeys that get produced. And so that's where we're kind of getting that brood data in 2022 and looking 2 years ahead.
And so for those listening, we're kind of zoning in here on the 24 spring season, just so we're kind of, be clear on that. But looking back at it too, were there a certain area of the state that maybe was the best? I know because it does vary.
Yeah. So the northern part of the state, and I know hunters kind of get upset if we name specific areas, so you don't want to draw too much attention. But generally, like the northern part of the state for about the last 15 years or so has trended better than a lot of the rest of the state. But the really amazing thing about that hatch we had in 2022 was it was statewide.
Okay.
So I've worked for the department for 16 years now, and that 2022 hatch was really the first one in my time period here where there was really not a bad part of the state. Every single part of the state had a really good turkey hatch, and so we were expecting every part of the state to increase. Now, if you increase, you've already got a lot of turkeys and you increase 20%, that's obviously more turkeys than if you're kind of at a lower level and increase by the same amount. But, everywhere in Mississippi, I think, was better this year than it's been, over the last decade or so. But there were definitely some hot spots. The folks that are blessed enough to hunt right along the Mississippi River behind the levees, they've luckily, everything over there is driven by the river. And if the Mississippi River doesn't flood in the spring, they usually do really well. And we've had a succession of years now, going back to really to 2020, 2021 in that time frame where the river is not flooded during the spring. So they've had a series of good hatches over there. So those populations over there, some of those hunting clubs on the river are doing as good or did as good this year as they've done in a really long time. So that was a really bright spot. The southeastern part of the state, kind of the Piney Woods area, really has been down for a long time, but they've bounced back in a big way the last couple of years. And I think they saw some of their better numbers this year than they've seen probably since the early 2000s. So really everywhere did well. Some places did better than others. And, that's not to say that every single hunter probably had their best season, but overall, things were much better this year than where they've been over the last, decade or a little more.
So just to give listeners a perspective, an example of a poor year, a bad year in comparison to what we've seen.
So the way we look at the brood survey, the metric that we sort of pull out of that is it's kind of a biology nerdy term we call poults per hen, which is sort of a measure. The easiest way to think about it, it's the ratio of the little ones to the big ones.
Okay.
So you got mama hen and then you got all the little ones, and we're looking across the entire population of turkeys. So like some hens don't have any poults. They didn't lay a nest or their nest got eaten, so they don't have any. And then some, hatch off a nest successfully and might have, 8 or 10 or 12 little ones with them. So we average that across, kind of the whole population. Typically what we want to see is that poult per hen number be at least like 1.8 or so as a ratio. So that's 1.8 little ones to every mama, every hen in the population. The 2022 hatch was like 2.3, which is really, really good. So anytime we see reproduction at that level, like above about 2 poults per hen, you're going to see the population grow. Mm-hmm. And if you look regionally within the state, so that statewide number was well above 2, but regionally within the state, there were some areas that had a lot more than that. Like again, going those areas along the Mississippi River were like close to 4 poults per hen, wow. Like just really, really high. Like it was actually some of the highest we had ever documented in the 30 years we've been doing that survey. So just everything really lined up well in 2022 to have a really great turkey hatch, and that translated into increasing turkey numbers, which 2 years later, when those birds become adults, set up really well for this hunting season.
You mentioned the 15,000-ish, number, and that would be reported.
Right. That's the number that got reported to the game check system during the season. So the real time total.
Okay. And then in other words, there could be potentially, we're not saying there is, but there could be potentially numbers that aren't reported that would take that number beyond.
Right.
That.
For sure. Like we're not, definitely not so naive as to think that, everybody's reporting every turkey. I think most everybody would say that's not realistic. So we do have another survey that tries to get at an estimated total. And so oftentimes you'll see us talk about or report a harvest total that might be different from what the game check total was. And that's because we're looking at what the estimate. And, it is an estimate. I always stress that. But it's an estimate done kind of through statistical means that are defensible. So like I'll give you a football example. Like when you hear somebody say, 3 million people watched the Super Bowl. Nobody actually asked 3 million people, did you watch the Super Bowl? What they do is they take, a small subsample of everybody who has a television and say, what did you watch on Super Bowl Sunday? And then they kind of have an estimate of how many TVs there are in the United States, and they extrapolate that out. So we do the same thing. Every year after hunting seasons are over, we run a survey where we pull a subsample of license holders, and they get a telephone call. It's done phone-based nowadays. And they're asked, did you go deer hunting? How many days did you deer hunt? How many deer did you take? Did you go turkey hunting? How many days did you turkey hunt? How many turkeys did you take? And then that subsample is extrapolated out to everybody who bought a hunting license. So we can say, of all the licensed hunters, this is how many turkey hunters we think there might be, and this is how many turkeys we think might have gotten taken. Interestingly, last year, so we don't have that number yet for 2024. That usually takes a couple of months to get done. And that's one of the benefits of having the game check system is it's providing you real-time data. So we're constantly wanting to get that number to be more in line, with the other number. Right. That's an objective we have. So it takes a couple of months to get it. So we don't have it for 24, but we do have it for last year, for 2023. And last year was a really good harvest by that number. So we were up around about 35,000 turkeys was the total estimate from last year, which was actually up a lot, over kind of the decade prior. So regardless of which number you pick, and if you're dealing with statistics, you're always having to factor in there's going to be biases with everything, and you got to just weigh all that out. But either number you pick, the last 2 years have really been much better times for us in terms of turkeys than, say, the decade before, where there's been a lot of anxiety and worry about populations.
Yeah. Again, this is just an observation, sort of, looking at a distance, but it just appears like the turkey hunting community, the people that are, as eat up with it and crazy about it as you and others, it's really a group of people that want to participate in the data and in the surveys because they really want to be a part of it and want it to be as good as it can be. Don't you find that? Absolutely.
And I mean, I think that's always been the case, but it's more so the case now. And I think, just stuff like this, just podcasts, just the stuff that's available on the internet, there's just so many more resources out there now. When you and I were younger, it was Outdoor Life or just a magazine, and it's usually a hunting store. Well, now there's still that, but now there's all the science and stuff is so much more readily available to just the average person. And I think you're right. Like turkey hunters, I'm biased a little bit towards them, but I think probably all hunters, but they're always interested in learning more, because hunting is so much more than just a hobby for most people. It's really, for most, it's sort of a central passion to their life. And so just like any kind of passion, you want to learn all you can about it. And I'm finding that more and more. There's a lot of media out there. I'm shocked. I'm very shocked regularly now by just how much people know, about turkeys. And it's because there's just so much more out there to digest. And I think people are hungry for it and they want it.
Right. They want it. And they talk about the things they want. And there's always those conversations, even outside of the season. One of those you hear is in other states, there's a kind of a duck stamp type of program, a turkey stamp program in other states. And you hear talk about that, from people in Mississippi all the time, don't you?
Right. So, yeah, big discussion about that this year, and I think that conversation will probably be ongoing. And mentioning a turkey stamp, it's following on the heels of a really successful model with duck stamp. I mean, the federal duck stamp has been around for, probably 80 years or more. We've had a state duck stamp going back to at least the early 1970s, and so those things have paid a lot of dividends for hunters. And to me, if you're a hunter, you should want that, because that pretty well puts in law that, resources have to be spent on the species that you're interested in. So if, in the case of ducks, we can't use that money for bass. Right. We have to use that money for ducks. And so as a hunter, that should be something that resonates with you, that, hey, I know I'm paying this, but these dollars are going to something I care about, and that they've got to put the focus on this resource that I really care about. And you're right, like several other states have those. Florida, I think, is probably in our region the one that's the most prominent. They have a turkey stamp, and it generates a lot of money. Every year they publish a kind of report on what those stamp dollars go to. They fund all kind of habitat projects in their state and research and stuff like that in their state. And so it's a great tool to make sure that the prioritization and the dollars sort of follow where people's heart is on the resource.
It's almost like or should be viewed, it sounds like, and it is viewed in some of the other states, like an investment, a direct investment by the hunter into the sport they love.
Absolutely.
It goes right to benefit
Absolutely.
what they love to do.
I'm a hunter too, and that's why it's something I'm passionate about, because it ensures that the state agency will always have the eye on the ball when it comes to that species, because you're tying the financial resources to the management in a direct way. It also helps solve another problem we already mentioned, that all of our estimates on who's turkey hunting and how many turkey hunters we have are just that, estimates. So if you kind of actually have something that you got to get when you go turkey hunting, now it allows more of a direct. We know how many of those hunters we have. We can directly communicate with them because we know who they are. Hey, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? It makes a lot of those kind of things easier if you can separate out that segment of the hunting population and directly communicate with them on the issues that they care about.
Yeah. And I realize this is a pun, but it kind of kills two birds with one stone.
Yeah.
Or more than two.
Right.
And you're free to use that if you want to down the road.
Yeah.
But, it just sounds like it's one of those things too that you've heard talk about it. There's been a lot of talk. There is a lot of talk. It sounds like one of those things that just kind of makes sense. Now, that's just my perspective, but it just looks like it makes sense.
Well, it's mine too, but I think it's not. That's not a crazy perspective to have, because we've got examples of that. We've got duck stamp's been wildly successful. I mean, if you're a duck hunter and you've enjoyed some of our public duck hunting areas, they've probably benefited from projects coming from duck stamp dollars. If you've turkey hunted in Florida, you've probably benefited from projects from turkey stamp dollars in Florida. So it to me, it's an easy thing to say yes to.
Maybe the only question I have remaining for you, Adam, is how does a guy who played as much baseball that takes place in the springtime of the year also become such an avid turkey hunter? Don't those two things overlap and make it hard on each other?
Well, Matt, I'm probably not a great turkey hunter, but I'm probably a better turkey hunter than I was a baseball player.
I got it.
It's a wonderful time of the year, man, for a lot of people, because just so many things that people really enjoy are wrapped up in that time of the year. And I always think, like, here in Mississippi, we're not. There's a lot of places that in the fall of the year have really pretty colors, and we get some fall colors, but not. It's not like Maine or the Upper Midwest or the Smoky Mountains. But man, the springtime woods here are gorgeous. Like, to me, it is the best time to be out here in Mississippi, because everything's budding out and all those different shades of green, and the weather's just perfect usually during turkey season. It's just it's an awesome time to be out.
Yeah. So a banner year, spring of 24. We talked about that for turkey hunters and for turkey hunting in Mississippi. If you had a magic wand and you could wave it out there and get what you want for 25, what would that look like?
Well, I think we're set up pretty good for 25 too. So going back to the brood data and everything, I said you kind of got to look 2 years ahead. The 2023 turkey hatch was almost as good as the 2022 hatch for most of the state. So I think folks in the lower 2/3 of the state are going to be just as good. Now that 23 hatch dropped a little bit in North Mississippi, but again, they're already sitting pretty good on number of birds. So I think we're actually set up for a pretty good run of years now. Knock on wood, a lot with turkeys, it can break your heart. They have ups and downs, and I hope the bottom doesn't fall out of us anytime soon, because that has happened in the past, where you see some of those bad hatch years and the population drops, and then we kind of suffer through some poor seasons for a series of years. But right now we seem to be set up, with a pretty good roll of the dice to get us through the next couple of years. So I'm expecting 25 to be pretty solid.
Cool. Adam,
thanks.
It's good to
thank
see
you.
Again. That's Adam Butler, Turkey Man here at MDWFP. on the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. We appreciate you listening, and we'll see you outdoors.